Good evening. Delightful to be back. So many friends that I haven't seen for so long. Beautiful. Well, this is the fourth 6-week series that we're doing together. As she mentioned, we did the Old Testament, New Testament, and world religions. There's a sense in which the first three kind of make sense as a sequence, because if you start with the Old Testament, how's my microphone? Is that fine? Okay. If you start with the Old Testament, then you're starting beginning of the Bible, Adam and Eve, creation, and all that. We're looking in a kind of a chronological sequence, which opens us into the New Testament period. That was roughly from 30 AD, if we want to say that's when Jesus died. That seems probable. Up till somewhere around 125, when the last of the New Testament books was written. The third sequence that we did was on church history, which continued the chronology. And we saw what happened to the church from roughly the end of the New Testament period, around 125, all the way up to the present day. So there's a continuity going on in those first three series that we did, Old Testament, New Testament, church history. What we did last fall was to open it out. Having done Old, New, and church history, we were always within the parameters of our Western culture and our Western religion. What we did last time was to broaden it out into a worldwide perspective and take a survey of all of the other religions. Well, what we're going to do this spring doesn't fit the sequence. It's not intended to be part of an ongoing movement the way that the first three were. What happened this time was Marguerite made the mistake of saying to me, do whatever you want. And I said, I want to do the wisdom literature of the Old Testament, because not only do I find these books very exciting in and of themselves, but I also think that they don't get much publicity. You just don't hear as much about these books as you do historical books like Genesis and Exodus, or prophetic books like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and so on. So let's consider exactly what books we're talking about here when we talk about the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. If you happen to have been here 2 or 3 years ago when we started that earlier sequence and we surveyed the Old Testament, you'll remember that we divided the Old Testament into 3 major sections. The first major section of the Old Testament was the historical books. The historical books include several collections of books. You have the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, hence the word penta. Teukos is Greek for scroll, so Pentateuchos means the 5 scrolls. These are the books that Jews refer to as the Torah because they emphasize the law aspect of those books. So, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That's the first subsection of the historical books. Then you had what is referred to as the Deuteronomistic history. The Pentateuch contains materials that date all the way back to David and Solomon's time, as far as being written down goes, even earlier as far as creating the stories. And was probably compiled in its present form somewhere around 400 BC. The Deuteronomistic history was a set of books that was compiled in order to give us information about the history of the Jewish people that can't be found in that earlier set. The Pentateuch begins with Adam and creation, but it ends with Moses. Moses, as far as we can figure out archaeologically, seems to have died right around the year 1220 BC. So we don't have any information in the Pentateuch beyond that point. By the time the Deuteronomistic history was written down, probably around 550 BC, Jews wanted to know what had happened since then. And so an editor or editors used a bunch of sources that pre-existed, especially court records that had been kept about what happened in each of the king's reigns, and compiled this set of books. The Deuteronomistic history consists of 6 volumes that come right after the Pentateuch: Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. Later on, somebody slipped the book of Ruth in here. So there's actually 7, but Ruth wasn't part of the original Deuteronomistic history. I suspect they stuck Ruth in because it's a short story that takes place during the time of the Judges, and so they stuck it in right after Judges. So it's actually Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. Then you have the chronicler's history. This was written by a Jew. We don't know what his name was. We just called him the chronicler. And he probably wrote around the year 400. But unlike the guy or guys who wrote the Deuteronomistic history, which picks up the story where the Pentateuch left off, Joshua was right after Moses, right? So if the Pentateuch goes from Adam to Moses, first book you get in the Deuteronomistic history is Joshua right on down to 550. This fella decided to write a compressed version of everything that had been written before. And so he wrote a 4-volume history. Volume 1 is 1st Chronicles, and 1st Chronicles is a summary of the Pentateuch. Volume 2 is 2nd Chronicles, and 2nd Chronicles is a summary of the Deuteronomistic history. It's what happened from Joshua down to the Babylonian exile, 550. It's the last 2 volumes that are especially interesting because they give us new material. What happened from 550 to 400 to the Jews. And we wouldn't know what happened there if we hadn't had this history written by the chronicler. Those last 2 books of his, in addition to 1st Chronicles, 2nd Chronicles, are Ezra and Nehemiah. And those are the 2 books that tell us what happened to the Jews during the period 550 to 400. In addition to these 3 multi-volume works, if you want to think of them that way, we have a collection of 3 short stories inserted into the Old Testament at this point. Those 3 short stories are Tobit, Judith, and Esther. And then lastly, in the historical books of the Old Testament, we have Maccabean history. The Maccabees are the Jewish kings from 165 to 63 BC. There's 2 books in the Maccabean history section of the Old Testament, 1st Maccabees and 2nd Maccabees. Now, given the fact that we got 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, you would assume that 1st and 2nd Maccabees are volume 1 and volume 2 of a single work. But they're not. Somebody wrote 1st Maccabees, and somebody else who didn't know he was writing his wrote 2nd Maccabees. And they both cover roughly the same events. What happened during the Maccabean kings, 165 to 63. So, for a date for these, we can say circa. In other words, approximately or roughly 100 these got written. the historical books of the Old Testament. I mentioned these subdivisions to refresh your minds if you happen to have been here earlier, or to let you know about these if you hadn't been. But that's only the first of the three major divisions of the Old Testament. The second major division is wisdom literature. In the wisdom literature section of the Old Testament, there are only 7 books. And since there's only 7 books, you don't really need to subdivide them. There's not that many that they would need subdivisions. So instead of headings like this, we're simply going to list the 7 books that are in the wisdom literature. They are let me move this, because I know it's in the way for some of you. The 7 books in the wisdom literature section of the Old Testament are Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Kohelet, Song of Songs, Wisdom, and Sirach. Obviously, I want to talk about those primarily tonight. So before we get into detail with them, let me just finish off my survey of the whole Bible so that we can see the wisdom literature in the context of the whole. So we've got the first 2 major divisions of the Old Testament, historical books. The second major division, the wisdom literature. The third major division, as you might expect, are the prophetic books. And there's quite a few prophetic books, just like there's quite a few historical books. So many that we subdivide them the same way we subdivide these. But here we divide them according to length. We put all the big fat ones in the front, and we put all the little skinny ones in the back. So we have the major prophets, and we have the minor prophets. There are 4 major prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. Those are the relatively long prophetic books. Isaiah is 66 chapters, Jeremiah is 56 chapters, Ezekiel's 48 chapters, Daniel's only 12, but they're very long. And none of the minor prophets are anywhere near as long as Daniel. I'm not going to write the minor prophets because you can look up in the Bible and save me the effort of putting all those 12 names up there. But they are Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. And that brings us to the New Testament. So there's the whole Old Testament. Historical books, wisdom literature, and prophetic books. Kind of a neat way to arrange the Old Testament, because you've got all the books that are looking backward, all the books in past tense first. Then you've got all the books that are telling you how to live your daily life, kind of, the wisdom literature, present tense books in the middle, and then you've got all those future-looking books, prophetic books, future tense books, at the end. And having the prophetic books right at the end leads us naturally into the New Testament, where Jesus, whom they refer to, appears. So the wisdom literature section of the Old Testament is the smallest. It's kind of a midget stuck in here between these 2 big giants. That's one reason why we don't get a lot of publicity for the wisdom literature books of the Old Testament. But there's a lot of wonderful stuff in these books. First of all, let's consider what we mean by the title. It's traditional to refer to these books as the wisdom literature. In Jewish Bibles, for the most part, they're referred to as the Ketuvim, which simply means writings. But we like to call them by a more descriptive term, we call them the wisdom literature. Now, the phrase wisdom literature has two words in it, one of which is a noun, and so it's the more foundational of the two, one of which is an adjective describing the noun. Let's start with the noun. What does literature make you think? What's literature make you think of? Stories. Sure. Short stories are one type of literature. True? What's another type of literature?
Poems.
Sorry? Poems. Yeah. What else? Don't we have any Tom Clancy fans? Novels, right? Novels are a type of literature. What else? Biographies? Oh. Biographies are one type of non-fictional literature, right? There's other types. Maybe we should use a broader category. How about non-fiction? I can think of one more category. What else do you study in English literature classes? How about Shakespeare? Plays, right? Plays are also a type of literature. Now that's what most of us think of with the word literature. Granted, the word can have a broader meaning than that. The word can mean anything written. You can go into a travel agency because you're interested in going to Acapulco, and you could say, I'm interested in going to Acapulco. Do you have any literature on that? They hand you a brochure. That's literature. But that's not what we normally think of as literature. Normally we mean what the French call belles lettres, beautiful letters. We mean artistic writing. Not a laundry list, even though it's literature in the broad sense. Now, how well does this idea of literature as aesthetic literature, beautiful literature, apply to our 7 books? What about Psalms? Poetry, definitely. What about Proverbs? Poetry. Each of those little couplets is in verse. Song of Songs is in verse, so that would fit. That's poetry. And the last one, Sirach, is in poetry. So in a way, poetry kind of predominates among the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. Now that leaves us with 3 other books. I put the name Kohelet up here because that's the name for this book that it has become increasingly used by scripture scholars. But it used to go by another name, and you might be more familiar with it by the old name. That's right. Ecclesiastes. Have you heard of that? Have you heard of Kohelet? See? Over the last 100 years, people have started to use Kohelet instead of Ecclesiastes. Main reason for that is that this book down here used to go by another name that was very similar to Ecclesiastes. It used to be called Ecclesiasticus. And back when those were the only 2 names that people used, Ecclesiastes and Ecclesiasticus, there could be a certain amount of ambiguity. If you're reading an article and you see a quotation from the Bible, and afterward in parentheses they say ECCL period 3:2. Is that Ecclesiastes chapter 3 verse 2, or is that Ecclesiasticus chapter 3 verse 2? So in order to get rid of the ambiguity, people have started using these other two terms instead, Kohelet and Sirach, naming them after names of authors that are in the books. While we're talking about titles, we should mention too that there's an alternate name for Song of Songs. It's also called Song of Solomon. You may have heard it under that term. Or it's sometimes called Canticle of Canticles. That's because the Latin word for song is cantus. And so Bible translations that were based upon the Latin Vulgate translation, in other words, Catholic translations into English, tended to use canticle rather than the word song. So this particular term really derives from the Douay-Rheims Bible. If you remember the old Douay-Rheims translation. English Catholics translated the Bible from the Vulgate Latin to English in 1609. And it was revised in 1754. That's the Douay-Rheims Bible. And lastly, while we're still talking about names for these books, this one here has multiple names. Often, it's just called wisdom. But that can be ambiguous because you might be talking about wisdom in general. All of these books are wisdom. Difference being that if you're talking about wisdom in general, you got a lowercase w. If you're talking about the book of wisdom, you got uppercase w. But still, it can offer a certain amount of ambiguity. So some people refer to it as the Book of Wisdom. You'll sometimes see that title. If you ever see Book of Wisdom, you know they're talking about number 6 in the set of wisdom literature. And there's one third title that also the book sometimes goes by, and that is Wisdom of Solomon. You'll sometimes see it referred to that way. Okay, now we got off on names there while we were still trying to see how well the word literature applies to this set of books. And we've got 4 books that are definitely poetry. Some of the Book of Wisdom is in verse. But some of it, in fact the majority, is in prose. So I'm not sure we can include it on the grounds that it's poetry. But what we can do is say that wisdom fits into beautiful essays. The Book of Wisdom is philosophical musings about life. And even though some of those are in prose and some of them are poetry, we can still include them under the aegis of non-fictional subject. Same thing is true for Kohelet. Kohelet is largely prose. There's a few little sections that are poetry. But it does deserve to be here because it is philosophical musings on life, and it's very beautifully written. Certain passages of it anyway. Well, we've justified all of the books except Job. Now, if we wanted to, we could justify Job's presence among the wisdom literature by pointing out that it is in poetry. Job is 42 chapters long. There's approximately 3 1/4 chapters that are not poetry, that are in prose. But almost all of it is in poetry. So we could justify it on those grounds And it is a play. If you look at chapter 4, it'll say, Job said, comma, and the rest of chapter 4 is Job. If you look at the beginning of chapter 5, it'll say, Bildad said, comma, and the rest of chapter 5 is all Bildad. Or chapter 38 says Yahweh said, and Yahweh's author 2 chapters. It's just like a play, where you have somebody speak for a while, and somebody else speak for a while, and somebody else speak for a while. Now that means that in the wisdom literature section of the Old Testament, we've got these genres represented, these categories of literature. We've got poems, we've got plays, and we've got nonfiction. What about short stories? No short stories. Not in the wisdom literature section, because, why? They're already over there in the historical books, remember that? 3 short stories? Tobit, Judith, and Esther. Why did they get put in the wisdom in the historical book section of the Old Testament rather than the literature section? Possibly because people thought they were factual rather than fictional. That could be. More probably because they are written in prose and they are past tense about previous events, previous times. In fact, you could argue that if you wanted to make a section of the Old Testament that included short stories, you wouldn't just have Tobit, Judith, and Esther. You'd have to pull in Ruth. Remember, it got stuck there after Judges because it takes place in the time of the Judges, but it's a short story. You could add that for a 4th one. Plus, among the prophetic books, one of the minor prophets is a short story. That's the book of Jonah. Unlike all the other minor prophets, it's not a collection of oracles that Jonah said. It's a story about the prophet Jonah. So we could make a collection of short stories like that if we wanted. But suffice it to say, those short stories are already elsewhere in the Bible, and so we don't wind up with any short stories here. How about novels? Certainly not in the wisdom literature. Are there any novels? Not in the modern sense. There are no novels in the Bible. That's a genre that had to await creation outside the Jewish cultural milieu. Probably the earliest novels are Greco-Roman. Petronius's Satyricon was back around 1st century AD. So that's a genre that's more recent, really, than the biblical times. Okay, so much for the noun. The noun is literature. What about the adjective? What is wisdom? What does that make you think of? Now, don't look at her. Come on now. You, yes.
Knowledge.
Sure. Would we all agree that wisdom is a kind of knowledge? But does all knowledge qualify as wisdom? If I've got a biology textbook in front of me, that's certainly full of all kinds of knowledge, but is it wisdom?
Not understanding.
It's got to be some kind of knowledge different from just this sort of...
acquired knowledge, but you learn like that.
Yeah, it's got to be some kind of experiential knowledge. How about knowledge from experience? That's better, don't you think? I totally agree. But even with that, I'm not sure we've reached where we need to be, because what about the kid who doesn't do too well in school, and so he drops out when he's 16, and he apprentices himself to the local service station guy, and he learns how to do cars really well, till then someday he has his own service station, and works for 40 years and retires. Now, he has incredible knowledge from experience, right? He knows all the little intricacies of Honda, Toyota, all these little differences in their motors and pistons and so on, but that is not wisdom. Agreed? wisdom has to be about not just auto mechanics, but yeah, life. It's got to be about morality, don't you think? It's got to involve moral. Excuse me? How to live your life. Yeah, that's good. Should we just go with morality, or should we include religion? Why should we include religion? Did you say yes? You did, okay. Yeah, why do you? Proverbs 1:7, you're exactly right. Most people, I think, would include religious, which a person develops over a lifetime, right? A deeper and deeper understanding of the spiritual aspects of life. And that we credit to those of us with gray hair. That's wisdom.
Does that not include also intuitive when you get into the spiritual realm?
If by intuitive you mean direct apprehension, yeah, I think that's true. A person's direct apprehension of God tends to deepen over that person, or hopefully does. Should. So what do you think? Shall we go with morality and religion? Would that be agreeable to everyone? If so, then we can define wisdom as knowledge from experience about religion and morality. That's not a definition I've ever seen anywhere, but it seems accurate. Does anybody want to add anything further? Yes, sir.
I would say that wisdom is a form of sagacity. It's a profound knowledge, born of study, contemplation, life experience, and all the means of learning available to the mind. Wisdom. It also touches on, implies the accuracy and truth of learning in learning.
I think that is an excellent definition. That's very good. You must have gained that over wisdom. Over lifetime. Hey, but mine is easier to remember. True, but I think he was including that. He included spiritual knowledge. Oh, yeah, but that's in here too, don't you think, under about religion?
But I remember you gave that definition in one of the books I read about
Uh-huh.
something.
Right. Well, as long as we definitely want to include God, but as long as we understand that we're including Him under religion, thank you, sir.
Well, mine is your condition.
Hey, the Jesuits taught him. We don't have to listen to him.
I learned to shoot tonight.
Oh, tonight you did. Oh,
You said that prayer. Well, you were just saying amen.
But that was...
That's right.
You were saying the sheep.
No, I didn't catch
No, but
it.
that word was referring to virtue.
Oh, no, this is referring to wisdom. Wisdom is shield. Yeah, right.
Wasn't it referring to virtue? It's very referring
Anyway, well, this is a great place to take a break. Shall we take a break for 10 minutes? Okay.